At my grandson's baby shower, my daughter-in-law had two of her friends pick up the cedar chest I'd spent 5 months building and carry it out to the curb, where they set it down next to the garbage cans for Tuesday pickup. "We're going clean lines in the nursery," she announced to the room, holding her phone out so her best friend could film her doing it. "No offense, but this is a little flea market." The whole living room did that nervous half-law people do when they're not sure if it's a joke yet. I didn't say anything. I didn't make a scene. I walked out the front door past the balloon arch, lifted that chest off the curb with my bad shoulder, slid it into the back of my station wagon, and drove home before the cake was even cut. That night, my son called me, and he could barely get the words out. "Mom," he said, "what did you put in the bottom of that chest?" I was sitting at my kitchen table with the chest right beside me, my husband's whole heart still hidden under the false bottom where nobody had thought to look. And I asked him, real soft, "Now why would you ask me that, honey? Because here is what my daughter-in-law set out with the trash in front of 30 people for the crime of being made by hand instead of bought in a store. And here is what happened in the weeks after, when this family finally found out what they'd almost thrown away." Welcome back to Strong Mom Stories, where the gift somebody calls cheap is usually the one thing in the room that no amount of money could ever buy back. Stay with me to the end of this one. Leave a comment when something hits you, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. My name is Marlene Pickett. I'm 66 years old, and for 38 years, I ran a little furniture and cabinet shop off Marigold Street in a town in eastern Ohio you've never heard of and don't need to. I built kitchen tables that are still feeding families today. I built pews for 2 churches and a confessional for a 3rd. I built coffins twice, both times for people I loved, and I'll tell you, you learn something about a man's whole life from the weight of the box you have to carry him out in. I know wood. I know it the way you know an old friend's voice through a wall. I can run my thumb along a board and tell you whether it was cut from a tree that grew up easy in good soil or one that had to fight for every ring. And I can tell you what a thing is worth, which is a different number entirely from what a thing costs, and the two of them have almost nothing to do with each other. My hands have started to quit on me the last few years. The doctor calls it osteoarthritis and offers me pills I don't take. What it means is that some mornings my knuckles are swollen up like marbles, and I can't grip a chisel until I've held them under the tap as hot as I can stand and worked them open slow. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you understand what 5 months of building a chest cost a woman whose hands don't want to close anymore, and why I did it anyway, and why it mattered so much that somebody set it out with the garbage. People look at a woman my age in a flannel shirt with sawdust on her sleeves, and they make a decision about her. Harmless, a little out of step, sweet old thing with her hobby. My daughter-in-law looked at me that way from the very first Sunday dinner my son brought her to. And I let her because I figured out a long time ago that there's a quiet kind of power in being underestimated. But I spent 38 years watching folks haul in some pressboard dresser from a big box store that fell apart in 2 years, and walk back out hugging a dresser my granddad built in 1939 that I'd just tightened the joints on. I know what lasts. I know what doesn't. And the night my son called me with his voice coming apart, I knew my daughter-in-law had just learned that difference the hard way, and there was no taking it back. But I have to start this where it really starts, which is with Hank. My husband, Hank Pickett, passed 14 months before that baby shower. We had 41 years together, and then a bad winter, and then a hospital room with a window that looked out on a parking lot, and then a house that got so quiet I started leaving the radio on just to have a voice in it. Hank wasn't a big man, and he wasn't a loud one. He drove the same Ford for 22 years and complained about getting rid of it. He bought his coffee at the gas station because he said the diner overcharged for the same beans, and he was right, but he tipped the gas station girl $5 every single morning anyway and thought I didn't know. That was Hank, tight as a drum on himself, soft as bread on everyone else. What I didn't fully understand until the very end was how far ahead that man was looking the whole time I knew him. While other husbands were buying boats and base trackers and getting divorced, Hank was buying boring little things and letting the years do the heavy lifting. "Marlene," he'd say, "the trick isn't being smart. The trick is being patient longer than everybody else is willing to be." He wanted to be a grandpa more than he ever let on. We waited a long while for it. Our son, I'll get to my son, married late, and the baby was slow to come, and Hank used to sit out on the back step and tell me all the things he was going to do. Teach the kid to bait a hook without crying about the worm. Teach him the difference between a maple and a sycamore. Teach him to drive a screw straight, which my own son, God love him, never did learn. Hank didn't make it. The baby was still just a due date on the calendar when his heart finally set down its tools and quit on us. But here's the thing about a man who thinks in decades. He'd been getting ready to be a grandfather for almost the whole length of our marriage, and he'd squirreled away the proof of it where he knew I'd find it when it counted. About 10 days before he died, when we'd both stopped pretending, Hank asked me to go down to the basement and bring up his old green tackle box from the shelf over the workbench. I'd seen that tackle box my entire married life. I assumed it was lures and split shot and the kind of junk a fisherman can't bear to part with. I was wrong. There was a tray of old lures on top. Sure, the kind with the paint worn down to bare metal. But underneath that tray, wrapped in a chamois cloth, was a folded sheaf of papers held together with a rubber band that snapped to dust the second I touched it. It was a deed to 4 acres on the north shore of Tamarack Lake, a little weedy lot with 100 feet of shoreline that Hank had bought in 1991 for almost nothing, back when nobody wanted lakefront, because the road out there flooded every spring. He'd paid it off in 11 years, $50 and $100 at a time, and he'd been paying the property taxes on it out of a separate account I never knew existed every single year for over 3 decades. Folded in with the deed was a stack of paper savings, bonds, the old paper kind you can't even buy anymore, and a coffee can full of silver dollars, one for every year, he told me, since before our son was old enough to drive. And there was a letter, sealed, unopened, my husband's blocky pencil on the front. "For my grandchild, on the day you're old enough to ask why. Started the lake in 91, Hank told me, his voice down to nothing but his eyes clear as creek water. Figured. Someday there'd be a little one who needed a place that was just theirs, that nobody could ever take or sell out from under them. Teach 'em to fish off that bank, Marlene." He squeezed my hand with what he had left. "Don't you let anybody turn it into money. Money gets spent. A place stays." I asked him what it was all worth now, the lake lot and the bonds and the rest. He just smiled at me, the way he did when I'd asked a question he thought I should know better than to ask. "More than enough," he said. "Less than the part that matters. So you understand." When that baby was finally on the way, I knew exactly what I was going to do with what Hank left, and exactly how I was going to give it. I built the chest myself, every board of it, even on the mornings my hands didn't want me to. Tennessee aromatic cedar, the kind that smells like a closet at your grandmother's house and keeps the moths off a baby's wool for 50 years. I hand-cut the dovetails because I don't trust a machine to cut a joint that has to outlive me. I carved a row of little jumping fish along the front rail because of Hank and the lake and the kid he was never going to get to teach. And in the bottom of that chest, I built a second floor, a false bottom that sits a half-inch up on a hidden lip, and you'd never know it was there unless you knew to press the back left corner and feel it give. Under that false bottom, I laid the deed to Tamarack Lake and the savings bonds, and Hank's silver dollars in the coffee can, and his sealed letter to a child who didn't have a name yet. Then I set the real bottom down over all of it, lined it with cedar shavings and a quilt my own mother made, and screwed a little brass plate to the inside of the lid that I had engraved at the trophy shop downtown. It just says, "For my first grandbaby, built by hands that won't always work." Look underneath. I wrapped that chest in a moving blanket, and I drove it over to the shower with the box-riding shotgun in the seat where Hank used to sit, and I talked to him a little on the way I still do. I had no earthly idea I was about to watch a stranger set my husband out on the curb with the trash. I should tell you about my daughter-in-law before I tell you what she did, because I'm not interested in painting her as some cartoon. Her name is Brittany, and she is not a stupid woman. And she is not, deep down, a cruel one. She grew up with a mother who measured everybody by the car in the driveway. And she married my son and moved into a subdivision full of women who do the exact same measuring. And she has spent every day since terrified that one of them is going to look at her too long and figure out she doesn't quite belong. I understand that fear better than she'd believe. I've felt the cousin of it my whole life. The difference is what you decide to do when you're scared somebody's going to find you out. Brittany decided the way to never get caught being not enough was to make absolutely sure everybody could see she only kept the most expensive things. And that day, my chest, smelling of cedar and somebody's grandmother, was the most expensive-looking cheap thing in the room, and it had to go. The shower was at their house, this big new build out in a development called Wexford Glen, where every house is the same beige and the lawns all get mowed on the same day. 30-some people, mostly Brittany's friends, a couple of women from her gym, her mother holding court by the charcuterie. I came in carrying the chest myself, because I'll be damned if I was going to ask one of those gym husbands to carry my own husband's heart across a room. I set it down in the spot they'd cleared for gifts, and I peeled the moving blanket off, and for 1 second, I'll hold on to this for the rest of my life. For 1 second, the room actually went quiet. A couple of the older women made that sound you make. One of them put her hand on her chest. The cedar smell came up and filled the whole room, and a young pregnant girl I didn't know said soft, "Oh my gosh, the little fish." For 1 second, that chest was the most precious thing in the house, and everybody in there knew it. Then Brittany walked over. She looked at it the way you'd look at a dog that wandered in off the street. She ran one French manicured nail along the carved fish and made a little face, and she said, loud enough for the friend with the phone, "Oh, wow, that's so sweet." The way she leaned on sweet, you'd have thought she'd bit into something gone bad. I mean, the effort. Truly. And then to the room with that bright hostess voice, "We're doing a whole clean Scandinavian thing in the nursery. All white oak, nothing fussy. So this is it's a little farmhouse flea market for the vibe we're going for, you know." A couple of people laughed because they didn't know what else to do. And she turned to 2 of her girlfriends and said, "Would you 2 be angels and just pop this out front? Movers can grab it." And those 2 grown women picked up my husband and carried him out the front door and set him down on the curb next to the garbage cans. And Brittany's friend filmed the whole thing for a video she captioned. I found out later, only the finest. For baby Hudson. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I think the not crying surprises people. I wasn't sad in that moment. I was tired. Bone tired, in the way you get when somebody shows you exactly who they are and you realize you're going to have to deal with it. I didn't argue. Arguing in that room would have made me the crazy one, the difficult mother-in-law, and they'd have had the video to prove it. So I got my coat. My son was standing by the kitchen island the whole time with a beer in his hand he wasn't drinking, looking at the floor. He didn't carry the chest out, and he didn't stop them from carrying it out. He just looked at the floor, and that, I'll tell you, hurt a great deal more than anything Brittany said, because Brittany owed me nothing, and that boy I raised owed me at least the courage to lift his eyes. I said my goodbyes to the few people who'd be sorry to see me go. I went out front. I lifted the chest off the curb, and let me tell you, a cedar chest with 4 acres of lakefront in the bottom of it does not get lighter, and I drove it home and set it on my kitchen table, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat with it. The phone rang a little after 10. It was my son, and he was crying. Not the choked-up kind. The real kind, the kind I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy, and we lost our old dog. "Mom," he said, and he couldn't get going for a second. "Mom, I keep." I went out to the curb to bring it back in, and it was gone, you already. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I just stood there and let them. And then he said the thing. He said, "Mom, what was inside it?" There's a little plate inside the lid. I read it before you wrapped it up. It says, "Look underneath." What did you put in there? What did we almost throw away? And I want you to hear the order of what my son was crying about. Because I have read enough comments under enough of these stories to know that's the part that matters to you, and it's the part that mattered to me. He was not crying about money. He didn't know yet there was money. He was crying because his mother had built something with hands that don't work right anymore, and he'd stood in his own kitchen and watched it get carried out with the trash and said nothing. That was what broke him open. The labor of it, the 5 months. My knuckles, he told me. Later it was the brass plate that did it. Built by hands that won't always work, that he'd glanced at it and not really read it. And then standing at that empty curb, it came back to him all at once and he understood what he'd let happen. I said, very gently. "Why do you want to know, honey?" he said. "Because I think I just figured out that I've been throwing away the important thing my whole life and calling it keeping the peace." I had him come over the next morning. I sat him down at the same table. And I pressed the back left corner of that chest the way you have to. And I lifted out the false bottom. And I showed my son what his father had been hiding for 30 years. I'll tell you, I have seen that boy cry exactly 4 times. The day his dog died, the day he got married, the day his father was buried. And that morning at my kitchen table, when I unfolded the deed to Tamarack Lake, and he read his father's pencil on the envelope. For my grandchild, on the day you're old enough to ask why, and understood that the chest his wife had carried out to the curb had 4 acres of his son's birthright sleeping in the bottom of it. And a letter from a dead man and a coffee can of silver his father had been setting aside since before he himself could drive. He didn't say a word about the value. He picked up his father's letter and he held it against his chest and he said, "She almost let the garbage truck take Dad." "She didn't know," I said, "because I'm not a cruel woman, and because it was true." "That's not the part that scares me," he said. "The part that scares me is I knew it was Mom's, and I knew what it cost you to build, and I still didn't move. I've been doing that for years. I've been letting her decide what's worth keeping, and I've been agreeing with her so the house stays quiet, and I never once asked myself what we were throwing out to keep it quiet." That's a hard thing for a man to learn about himself out loud at his mother's kitchen table. I let him have it. I didn't rescue him from it the way I'd rescued him from everything his whole life, which, if I'm being honest, is a good part of how he got to be a man who stands by an island with a beer he isn't drinking. I just put my hand over his hand and let him sit in it. Now, you want to know how it shook out, and I'll tell you, because I know you came for the reckoning and not just the feelings. But I want to be careful here, because the reckoning wasn't the satisfying one you might be hoping for, and I think the real one is better. I didn't sue anybody. I didn't stand up at a second family dinner and humiliate Brittany in front of her mother, though Lord knows the script for it wrote itself in my head about 40 times. What I did was simpler and it took longer. About a week later, my son brought Brittany to my house. She came in the way you come into a room when you know something happened that you don't fully understand yet and you suspect it's about to be your fault. I had the chest on the table, open, the false bottom lifted out, everything laid on the cedar shavings. The deed, the bonds, the coffee can, the letter. I let her stand there and look at it for a long minute before I said a word. Then I said, "Sit down. I want to tell you about my husband." And I did. I told her about the gas station coffee and the $5 tips. I told her about the lake lot bought in '91 when everybody said the road out there was no good. I told her about a man who saved silver dollars for 30 years for a grandchild who hadn't been conceived, who paid taxes on 4 acres because the building was single thing on. Because the building wasn't the point, the place was. I told her about my hands and the 5 months, and I held them up so she could see the knuckles, because she had never once looked at them, and I told her what was engraved in the lid, and I made her lean in and read it herself. "Look underneath." "That's the whole thing, Brittany," I said. "That's the whole problem in 3 words. You looked at the chest, and you saw a farmhouse flea market, and you were so sure that's all it was that you set it out with the trash without ever once asking yourself what might be underneath. You've been doing that to me since the day my son brought you home. You never looked underneath." She started to cry, and I'll give her this. She didn't do the pretty kind of crying for sympathy. She did the ugly kind, the kind that means it landed somewhere real. She said, "I didn't know there was anything inside it." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's exactly the point. You threw it away because of what it looked like, not because of what it was. That's the lesson, and you got it for free, and most people pay a lot more for it than you did." I softened then, because I'm not built to keep a knife in. I told her I wasn't doing any of this to shame her. I told her that baby was going to grow up in her house, learning what she taught him to value, and that someday he was going to need to know there was another way to measure a thing besides the price on the label. "The lake is for his future," I said. "The letter is for his heart. The chest." I put my hand flat on the cedar. "The chest is just to remind everyone in this family, me included, that the most valuable thing in any room is almost never the most expensive one." And then I turned to my son, and I said the hardest part because it was for him and not for her. "You stood by that island and you didn't move because not moving was easier, and you've been choosing easier your whole life, and I have let you, and that's partly mine to own. But I need you to hear me as your mother. That chest only made it home because I refused to be quiet about what it was worth, even when being quiet would have been a whole lot more comfortable for me. That's what your father left you, not the lake. The willingness to not be quiet." He nodded. He couldn't talk. He didn't need to. "Here's how it sits now. Several months on, because I know you want the ledger. The lake lot is in a trust for the baby, locked up tight, and it can't be sold or borrowed against by anybody. Not Brittany, not my son, not me, until that boy is grown and can decide for himself what a place that's just his is worth." The bonds and the silver came to a little over $50,000 all told, and that's set aside the same way, doing quietly for that child exactly what Hank intended it to do. The same patient thing Hank himself did, waiting longer than everybody else is willing to wait. Hank thought in decades. So now does his grandson's future. That video Brittany's friend made, the cute one, only the finest for baby Hudson. It turned out a good many people in their circle had already seen it before any of us knew what was in the chest. She took it down the day my son told her the truth, of course. But you know how it is now. Things don't really come down. Enough of those gym women had watched her set a homemade gift out with the garbage for a laugh that Brittany spent a long, quiet season being known in the only circle she'd ever cared about belonging to, as the woman who almost put her own son's inheritance out for the Tuesday pickup. I didn't do that to her. She filmed it herself. There's a whole sermon in that, about living your life for a camera, but I'll let you preach it. Brittany and I are not close, and I don't expect we ever will be, and that's all right. She has never quite managed a full apology because she's not built for it, and her mother sure never taught her how. But a few weeks after that day at my table, she asked me, in a small voice on the phone, if I'd show her how to sand. Just sand. She wanted to fix up an old rocker she'd found and was too embarrassed to admit she'd bought at a flea market. We've spent a few Saturdays out in my shop now, her in safety glasses, learning to feel for the grain, me with my hot water hands, and she is, of all things, patient at it. She refinished that rocker herself, every inch, and it's the ugliest, most lopsided, beautiful thing, and she put it in the nursery, and she didn't throw it out. That's a start. I've buried better people and stayed angry at worse for less, so I'll take the start. But it's my son who changed the most, and grief and shame did to that man in 3 months what 40 years of me, cleaning up after him, never could. They grew him a backbone. He came to me alone one evening and sat in the spot where the chest had been, and he said, "I've been replaying the shower, and I keep landing on the same thing. I didn't fail you when I let them carry the chest out. I failed you 100 times before that, every single time I went quiet to keep her happy. The chest was just the first one I couldn't look away from." I told him I'd known that about him for years. "Why didn't you ever say something?" he asked. "Because some things a person has to find for himself," I said. "I could have told you 1,000 times, and you'd have nodded and forgot. It took your father in the bottom of a cedar chest on a curb to make you believe me. He's different now, and I don't say that the easy way. He speaks up. He told Brittany no last month about something I won't repeat, and the house didn't fall down, and I think he was honestly surprised. He and Brittany are seeing somebody together, a counselor, which I never in my life thought I'd live to see. And he's already told me that he's going to be the one to take that boy out to Tamarack Lake and teach him to fish off Hank's bank, the way his father was going to. The way I'll make sure he knows his grandfather planned for 30 years before he was born. The chest sits in the nursery now. It took a while. I held on to it for a few months, long enough to be good and sure the house it was going into had learned, even a little, what it was holding. When I finally brought it over, Brittany had cleared a real place of honor for it, right under the window, and she'd put away the white oak designer thing that used to be there, and she didn't say one word about the vibe. She just watched me set it down, and she crouched, and she pressed the back left corner the way I'd taught her, and she lifted out the false bottom and looked at the empty space where her son's whole future had been sleeping the day she set it on the curb, and she touched the carved fish on the front, and she said, real quiet, "I never even saw these." I looked right at it, and I never saw them. "Most people don't," I told her. "You have to know to look. My hands are worse this winter than last. Some mornings the chisel wins, and I can't do a thing but sit with my coffee. But I'm building that boy a stool, slow. A few minutes on the good days, a little three-legged stool the right height to stand on and reach a workbench. I'm hiding his grandfather's initials in the underside of the seat, where he'll find them someday, if he ever thinks to turn it over, if anybody ever teaches him to turn a thing over and look. Because that's what we do, those of us who make things with our hands. We hide ourselves in them, quiet, and then we wait. Hank taught me that. Patience pays in a currency the impatient never get to spend. If there's one thing I'd hand you out of all of this, it's this. The world is going to tell you, louder every single year, that what a thing is worth is a number you can read off a tag. That the store-bought gift is the real one, and the handmade one is sweet but lesser. Don't you believe a word of it? The most valuable things in any room you ever walk into are almost always the quiet ones. The ones somebody made with their own two hands and gave you with no logo on them. And they are so easy to set out with the trash if nobody ever taught you how to look underneath. So, learn how to look. And whatever it is you love, build it into something that'll outlive your hands. And put your initials where they'll have to turn it over to find you. That's my story. One cedar chest, one curb, one Tuesday pickup that almost was, and a love that was worth more than a whole subdivision put together. If somebody once made you something by hand that you still have, a quilt, a chair, a chest, anything, go look at it tonight. And if the person who made it is still here, call them and say so before the chance gets kissed you out to the curb. Leave it down in the comments. Tell me what you've still got and who made it. And if this one found you, hit that subscribe, and I'll see you next time.